Interview with a Vampire, Book 1 of the Vampire Chronicles. Book is written by Anne Rice. Part 1. I see, said the vampire thoughtfully, and slowly he walked across the room towards the window. For a long time he stood there against the dim light from the Diversario street and the passing beams of traffic. The boy could see the furnishing of the room more clearly now. The round oak table, the chairs. A wash basin hung on one wall with a mirror. He set his briefcase on the table and waited. "But how much table do you have with you?" asked the vampire, turning now so the boy could see his profile. "Enough for the story of a life?" "Sure, if it's a good life. Sometimes I interview as many as 3 or 4 people a night if I'm lucky. But it has to be a good story. That's only fair, isn't it?" "Admirably fair," the vampire answered. "I'd like to tell you the story of my life, then. I'd like to do that very much." "Great," said the boy, and quickly he removed the small tape recorder from his briefcase, making a check of the cassette and the batteries. "I'm really anxious to hear why you believe this, why you know," said the vampire abruptly. "We can't begin that way. Is your equipment ready?" "Yes," said the boy. "Then sit down. I'm going to turn on the overhead light." "But I thought vampires didn't like the light," said the boy. "If you think the dark adds to the atmosphere—" But then he stopped. The vampire was watching him with his back to the window. The boy could make out nothing of his face now, and something about the still figure there distracted him. He started to say something again, but he said nothing, and then he sighed with relief as the vampire moved towards the table and reached out for the overhead cord. At once the room was flooded with the harsh yellow light, and the boy, staring up at the vampire, could not repress a gasp. His fingers danced backwards on the table to grasp the edge. "Dear God," he whispered, and then he gazed, speechless, at the vampire. The vampire was utterly white and smooth, as if he were sculpted from bleached bone. His face was as seemingly inanimate as a statue, except for 2 brilliant green eyes that looked down at the boy intently like flames in a skull. But the vampire smiled almost wistfully, and the smooth white substance of his face moved from the infinitely flexible but minimal lines of a cartoon. "Do you see?" he said softly. The boy shuddered, lifting his hand as if to shield himself from a powerful light. His eyes moved slowly over the fine-tailored black coat he only glimpsed at the bar. The long folds of the cape, the black silk tie knotted at the throat, and the gleam of a white collar that was white as the vampire's flesh. He stared at the vampire's full black hair, the waves that were combed back over the tips of the ears, the curls that barely touched the edge of the white collar. "Now, do you still want the interview?" the vampire asked. The boy's mouth was open before the sound came out. He was nodding, and then he said yes. The vampire sat down slowly opposite him, and leaning forward and gently, confidently, "Do not be afraid. Just start the tape." And then he reached out over the length of the table. The boy recoiled, sweat running down the sides of his face. The vampire clamped a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "Believe me, I won't hurt you. I want this opportunity. It's more important to me than you can realize now. I want you to begin." And he withdrew his hand and sat collected, waiting. It took a moment for the boy to wipe his forehead and his lips with a handkerchief, to stammer that the microphone was in the machine, to press the button to say the machine was on. "You weren't always a vampire, were you?" he asked. "No," answered the vampire. "I was a 25-year-old man when I became a vampire, and the year was 1791. The boy was startled by the preciseness of the date, and repeated it before he asked, "How did it come about?" "There's a simple answer to that. I don't believe I want to give simple answers," said the vampire. "I think I want to tell the real story." "Yes," the boy said quickly. He was folding his handkerchief over and over and wiping his lips now with it again. "There was a tragedy," the vampire started. "It was my younger brother. He died." And then he stopped. So the boy cleared his throat and wiped at his face again before stuffing the handkerchief almost impatiently into his pocket. "It's not painful, is it?" he asked timidly. Does it seem so? Said the vampire. No, he shook his head. It's simply that I've only told this story to one other person, and that was so long ago. No, it's not painful. We were living in Louisiana then. We received a land grant and settled 2 indigo plantations on the Mississippi very near New Orleans. Ah, that's the accent, the boy said softly. For the moment, the vampire stared blankly. I have an accent? He began to laugh. And the boy, flustered, answered quickly, I noticed it in the bar when I asked you what you did for a living. It's just a slight sharpness to the consonants, that's all. I never guessed it was French. It's all right, the vampire assured him. I'm not as much shocked as I pretend to be. It's only that I forgot it from time to time. But let me go on. Please, said the boy. I was talking about the plantations. They had a great deal to do with it, really, my becoming a vampire. But I'll come to that. Our life was both luxurious and primitive, and we ourselves found it extremely attractive. You see, we lived far better than we could have ever lived in France. Perhaps the shale wilderness of Louisiana only made it seem so. Seeming so, it was. I remember the imported furniture that cluttered the house. The vampire smiled. And the hamster sword. It was lovely. My sister used to play it. On summer evenings, she would sit at the keys to her back open to the French windows, and I can still remember that thin, rapid music and the vision of the swamp rising beyond her, moss-covered cypress floating against the sky, and there were the sounds of the swamp, a chorus of creatures, the cry of the birds. I think we loved it. It made the rosewood furniture all the more precious, music more delicate and desirable. Even when the wisteria tore the shutters of the attic windows and worked its tentacles right into the whitewashed brick in less than a year. Yes, we loved it. All except my brother. I don't think I ever heard him complain of anything, but I knew how he felt. My father was dead then, and I was the head of the family, and I had to defend him constantly from my mother and sister. They wanted him to take him visiting into New Orleans for parties, but he hated these things. I think he stopped going altogether before he was 12. Prayer was what mattered to him, prayer and his leather-bound Lives of the Saints. Finally, I built on an orrery removed from the house, and he began to spend most of his day every there, and often to the early evening. It was ironic, really. He was so different from us, so different from everyone, and I was so regular. There was nothing extraordinary about me whatsoever. The vampire smiled. Sometimes in the evening I'd go out to him and find him in the garden near the orrery, sitting absolutely composed on the stone bench there. And I'd tell him my troubles, the difficulties I had with slaves, how I distrusted the overseers or the weather or my brokers, all the problems that made up the length and breadth of my existence. And he would listen, making only a few comments. Always sympathetic, so when I left him, I had the distinct impression that he sought everything for me. I didn't think I could deny him anything, and I vowed no matter how it would break my heart to lose him, he could enter the priesthood when the time came. Of course I was wrong. The vampire stopped. For a moment the boy only gazed at him, and then he started as if wakened from deep thought, and he floundered as if he could not find the right words. He didn't want to be a priest? The boy asked. The vampire studied and was trying to discern the meaning of his expression. Then he said, I meant that I was wrong about myself, about not wanting to deny him anything. His eyes moved out of the far wall and fixed on the panes of the window. He began to see visions. Real visions? The boy asked. But again there was hesitation, as if he were thinking of something else. I didn't think so, the vampire answered. It happened when he was 15. He was very handsome then. He had the smoothest skin and the largest blue eyes. He was robust, not thin as I am now, and was then, but his eyes. It was as if when I looked into his eyes I was standing alone on the edge of the world on the wide-swept ocean beach. There's nothing but the soft roar of the waves. Well, he said, his eyes fixed on the window panes. He began to see visions. He only hinted at this at first, and he stopped taking his meals altogether. He lived in oratory, and any day of the hour of night I could find him at the bare flagstones kneeling before the altar. And the orrery itself was neglected. He stopped tending the candles or changing the altar clothes or even sweeping out the leaves. One night I became really alarmed when I stood in the rose arbor watching for him 1 solid hour, during which he never moved from his knees and never once lowered his arms, which he outstretched in front of him to form a cross. The slaves all thought he was mad. That concludes the first part. I'll come back for the second video.